This horrific event took place on Christmas Eve 2022 in the town of Oli Swildge, located on the outskirts of Liverpool, United Kingdom. The main character of this story is 26-year-old Elle Edwards, a young and attractive girl who worked as a cosmetologist in a local beauty salon and assisted a dermatologist. Elle was a true gem of her town. Her beauty and charm captivated everyone around her, and her kindness and positivity allowed her to find common ground even with the most demanding clients. This girl was not only beautiful on the outside, but also incredibly talented in her field. Thanks to her hard work and determination, she became a first-class specialist in her areas of expertise. Elle always greeted her clients with a sincere smile, radiating joy and optimism. It seemed that everything in this girl's life was going as well as possible. She relentlessly pursued her goals and dreams, building a successful career. But despite her busy schedule, Elle never forgot about her family. She was especially looking forward to Christmas because this year her sister Lucy was supposed to fly in from faraway Dubai. Just imagine how important this reunion with her beloved sister was for Elle. She couldn't wait for her arrival, planning how they would celebrate New Year's and Christmas together. After all, it is in such moments that we feel the value of family bonds and the warmth of loved ones most acutely. But unfortunately, this story will not have a happy ending. What was supposed to be a joyful celebration turned into a real nightmare. On December 24, 2022, Elle went to a local pub with her friends to celebrate Christmas while waiting for Lucy's arrival. They had no idea that this night would be fatal for them. As an experienced detective, I have encountered similar cases more than once. Even in the brightest moments of our lives, evil may be lurking nearby, and while we carelessly celebrate, someone may be planning the most terrible things. This is exactly what happened on that Christmas night in Oli Swildge when someone's bloody revenge destroyed the life of an innocent girl and her loved ones. So get comfortable, because next, I will tell you all the details of this chilling story, but only to those wonderful and amazing people who right now subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write any comments so that as many people as possible can see this video. Elle Edwards and her girlfriends decided to celebrate the long-awaited reunion with a bang. They chose the local pub, the Lighthouse, for this, where they planned to have a fun time while waiting for the arrival of Elle's sister Lucy. The girls could not even imagine that this night would turn into a real nightmare for them. The pub was filled with an atmosphere of joy and carefree fun. Elle and her friends laughed, danced, and sang karaoke, enjoying the festive mood. They were so caught up in the merriment that they did not notice how a person who had nothing to do with kindness and mercy appeared nearby. The Christmas idol was shattered at 23:50 when an alarming call came into the rescue service. Witnesses reported that at least 12 shots were fired at the exit of the pub, and worst of all, 2 bullets hit Elle directly. One of them seriously wounded the girl in the head. The dispatcher immediately sent emergency services to the scene. Medics urgently arrived at the pub and, having loaded Elle into an ambulance, rushed to the local hospital. They did everything possible to save the girl's life, but unfortunately, her injuries were incompatible with life. Elle died on the way to the hospital. When the police informed the family of the deceased about the tragedy, it came as a real shock to them. No one could believe that this could happen to their beloved Elle. This girl was the epitome of kindness, beauty, and joy. She had many friends, and it seemed that she could not have enemies capable of such cruelty. As an experienced detective, I understood that the investigation of this crime would not be easy. In the early stages, the investigators had no leads. The attacker appeared out of nowhere, committed his bloody massacre, and disappeared just as without a trace, leaving only shell casings and Elle's lifeless body behind. The nature of the attack indicated that it was carefully planned. The criminal thought out every step, not leaving his victim any chance of salvation. But the question that haunted us was whether Elle was the real target of the attack, or perhaps she became an accidental victim of some madman. When I heard what happened next, my breath caught in my throat from the tension. An unknown car stopped at the entrance to the pub, and a few minutes later, the shooting began. In addition to the deceased, 4 more men received gunshot wounds of varying degrees of severity. All of them were young people aged 22 to 33 who were spending time at the establishment that evening and lived in nearby suburbs. The police initially leaned towards the version that the murdered woman was an accidental victim. It was known that criminal groups periodically operated here, and the shooting probably became an ordinary showdown between their members. However, all this was just speculation that needed to be proven or disproven during the investigation, so the detectives studied the victim's personality in more detail. Elle's father, named Tim, was shocked by what happened. Just a few hours before the murder, he spoke with his daughter on the phone. They had a nice conversation and discussed the packing of Christmas gifts that Tim was doing. Like the witnesses of the crime, the victim's relatives did not think who could have wished for Elle's death. The girl seemed to have no ill wishes or enemies who could be capable of such horrors. The detectives decided to interview other witnesses and victims of the unknown criminal's bullets. In addition, law enforcement officers requested video surveillance footage from the pub owner. It was necessary to talk to dozens of people and analyze several hours of video recording. Friends, a very important point: the creation of such content requires a lot of time. And now my channel and I are going through a difficult financial situation. I will be immensely grateful to you if you become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. And in return, I will be able to personally respond to you in the comments and also mention your noble name in my video. So become sponsors, I will be immensely grateful to you. Eyewitnesses reported that shortly before the shooting, an unknown car stopped at the entrance to the pub. And just a few minutes later, shots rang out, taking the life of Elle and injuring 4 more young men. These guys, aged 22 to 33, just like Elle, were simply spending time at the Lighthouse pub on that fatal evening. They did not even suspect that they would become victims of a brutal attack. All the injured were local residents who lived in the nearest suburbs of Oli Swildge. At the beginning of the investigation, we had a version that Elle could have been an accidental victim of the shooting. The fact is that this was not the calmest area of the city. Local criminal groups periodically operated here, so the first thought was that the shooting could be related to a showdown between gangs. But as an experienced detective, I'll say that it's not worth jumping to conclusions. These were just guesses that needed careful verification. Therefore, the cops began to study in more detail the personality of the deceased girl to understand if she could have enemies capable of such a terrible crime. The investigators decided to question other witnesses of the tragedy and victims of the unknown shooter's bullets. Perhaps one of them noticed something important that could shed light on this dark story. Also, law enforcement requested video surveillance footage from the pub owner. This was a chance to track the movement of the criminal and understand how he ended up near the Lighthouse on that fatal night. Even with my experience working in the police, I was stunned by what happened next. Pay attention to some details regarding the car that the criminal was driving. This information turned out to be quite contradictory because witnesses of the event described the vehicle differently. Due to the darkness and panic, it was extremely difficult to see anything specific. However, after a thorough analysis of all the testimonies, the most likely version was a dark-colored Mercedes A-Class. And this guess was confirmed when the police studied the footage from external video surveillance cameras. An interesting fact was that the killer did not immediately open fire on the visitors of the pub. At first, he drove into the parking lot and for some time simply observed what was happening inside the establishment. It seemed that the attacker was waiting for something or someone. From the place where he stopped the car, there was an excellent view of the entrance to the pub and most of the premises. Obviously, the attacker was waiting for the most opportune moment for his bloody attack. And that moment came when Elle appeared on the street. The criminal quickly jumped out of the car, fired 12 shots into the crowd, and then just as quickly returned to the driver's seat and disappeared in an unknown direction. After a thorough study of all the surveillance camera recordings, the investigators came to an important conclusion: the attacker acted alone. There were no signs that anyone was helping him. Unfortunately, it was not possible to track the exact escape route of the criminal. Therefore, the police had to resort to a large-scale door-to-door survey. They talked to every resident of the neighborhood, describing the car and the circumstances of the crime, hoping to obtain at least some lead that would help identify the killer. Patrolling the streets of Oli Swildge took place around the clock, and these efforts were not in vain. Just 2 days after the shooting, detectives managed to detain 2 suspects at once. The police immediately informed the public and the media about this, but the names of the detainees were not disclosed until all the circumstances of the case were fully clarified. The only thing that became known was that the suspects were a 30-year-old man and a 19-year-old girl, but the investigation failed to prove their involvement in this terrible crime. During searches in the homes of the detainees, the weapon from which people were shot at near the pub was not found. Even now, as I'm telling you about this, I feel goosebumps running down my spine. After unsuccessful attempts to detain the real perpetrators of this terrible crime, the local police decided to make an official statement. They assured the public that they would not rest until the unknown shooter was behind bars and brought to justice. This statement was intended to at least slightly reassure the local residents of Oli Swildge, who were extremely outraged by the rampant crime on the streets of their city and the obvious powerlessness of the authorities. People felt unprotected and left to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, during the investigation, A new version emerged regarding the possible reasons for the attack. It was assumed that the shooting in the Lighthouse pub could be due to enmity between local gangster groups, and Elle, in this case, was just an accidental victim who simply found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, it is worth noting that at that moment, these were only guesses that required thorough verification. The investigators had yet to find strong evidence that would confirm or refute this version. During further investigation, it was established that the potential targets of the shooter that night could have been Jake Duffy and Kieran, Seld, members of one of the local gangs who were also relaxing in the pub on that ill-fated evening. As it turned out, these two had been in a fierce confrontation with another criminal group for a long time, which was trying to establish control over this part of the city. So it is quite likely that it was this enmity that could have caused the bloody massacre. On December 29, law enforcement officers managed to detain another suspect in this case. But as in the case with those previously arrested, it was not possible to prove his involvement in the shooting. The man had a reliable alibi that completely excluded him from the circle of suspects in the commission of this particular crime. However, the detectives assumed that the detainee could have been involved in organizing the attack. Perhaps he played the role of an accomplice or a spotter, but it was extremely difficult to prove this. Around the same time, the investigation finally managed to identify the car that the shooter was driving. It turned out to be a dark Mercedes that the criminal left in the parking lot near the pub. True, due to the lack of direct evidence, the name of the owner of this car was also not disclosed. But finding this car was not so easy. Detectives had to carefully study the footage from numerous video cameras. What happened next can only be compared to the plot of a high-octane thriller. At a time when it seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end, an event occurred that could have been a real breakthrough in this intricate case. On December 31, the police received a report of a fire that happened very close to the place where the attack on the visitors of the pub was committed. When our colleagues arrived at the call, they saw a shocking picture, a dark Mercedes, which according to the description of witnesses, very much resembled the car of the criminals, was completely engulfed in flames. The vehicle was burning like a torch, and it was clear that it could no longer be saved. This was a real blow to the investigation. After all, not only possible material evidence that could shed light on the identities of the attackers burned in the fire, but also perhaps the murder weapon itself. The experts could only throw up their hands. The chances of finding something valuable after such a fire were practically zero. Of course, the detectives immediately suspected that this was an intentional arson. The criminals, apparently, felt that the police were getting close to revealing their identities and decided to destroy all possible evidence of their involvement in this bloody massacre. However, even despite the fact that the fire left almost no traces, forensic scientists still managed to establish one important detail: this Mercedes was used during the attack on the pub. True, the car itself did not belong to the criminals, but was stolen shortly before the tragic events of Christmas night. Such a brazen attempt to hide traces only confirmed the investigators' guesses that representatives of the criminal world were behind the shooting. It is quite likely that the arson was only one of the elements of a carefully planned operation to eliminate competitors. It would seem that after this, the investigation would again find itself at a dead end. But on January 11, a real breakthrough occurred. Two suspects in this case were delivered to the police station at once. They turned out to be a 22-year-old man and a 23-year-old woman who were detained in central Wales. The young man, who was called Connor Chapman, was of particular interest to the detectives. Why? Because he was already well known to law enforcement officers for his criminal biography. Over the past 5 years before the murder of Elle Edwards, Chapman managed to light up in numerous offences and crimes. Connor started, like many others, with minor violations of the law. But over time, his appetites grew, and he plunged deeper and deeper into the criminal swamp. It seemed that this guy was not going to stop there at all, and in every possible way sought to establish himself in the status of a reckless criminal. The detention of Chapman certainly added optimism to the investigation. It only remained to hope that the interrogation of this suspect would finally provide answers to the questions that had been haunting all of Oli Swildge for so long. After all, every resident of this small town wanted only one thing: that those guilty of the death of innocent Elle would be brought to justice. I almost fell off my chair when I heard what happened next. I would like to focus your attention on the personality of one of the main suspects, Connor Chapman. His biography is a prime example of how a person can find himself on the wrong path and eventually slide to the very bottom of the criminal world. As it became known from police archives, one of Connor's first serious crimes was car theft. And this was not an ordinary theft. The guy committed this crime under aggravating circumstances. That is, from the very beginning of his criminal career, Chapman acted boldly and uncompromisingly. Later, his name began to appear in case files about robberies, hooliganism, and threats. It seemed that this young man was simply incapable of living according to the law and received some kind of perverse pleasure from violating all possible rules and norms. Once Connor even became a participant in a real Hollywood-style chase. Fleeing from the police, he abandoned the stolen car and tried to hide in the bushes. And even when he was caught up and detained by law enforcement officers, this young criminal managed to make a surprised face and declare that he did not understand at all what the chase in question was about. According to him, he was just waiting in those bushes for his friend. Chapman's cynicism knew no bounds. But it was this very adventure that made him truly famous. The press started talking about the desperate guy. His name flashed on the front pages of local newspapers. Interestingly, Connor grew up in Birkenhead, a suburb of Liverpool, under the care of his grandmother and grandfather. His parents left the boy in early childhood, so the elderly relatives had to take care of raising their grandson. Despite all their efforts, Connor embarked on a criminal path early. Chapman's problems with the law began in his teens. He dropped out of school shortly before the final exams, although to be honest, no one had any particular hopes for him. The guy had always studied poorly and was considered a problem child. Connor first found himself in the dock in 2014 when he was only 14. Then he was accused of shoplifting. Who knows, maybe it was the lenient sentence for this crime that inspired the teenager to further offenses. Already in 2016, Chapman again came to the attention of law enforcement. This time he was caught during another car theft. The guy was detained right in the stolen car, behind the wheel of which he was without a license and insurance. Moreover, by his actions, Connor violated the conditions of the previous sentence, according to which he was released early. Another year passed, and in 2017 Chapman distinguished himself again. This time, in addition to the traditional car theft, there was also the possession of prohibited psychotropic substances. And again, the guy ignored all the prohibitions and warnings, because at that time he was already under police supervision. The denouement of this story turned out to be so shocking that I still can't find the words to describe my emotions. As a result of his illegal actions, the guy was banned from visiting several areas of the city. He was clearly ordered not to appear in public places, because with his behavior he posed a real threat to others. But could such bans stop Connor? Already the next year, 2018, he again came to the attention of the police when he was detained during a patrol. And again in a public place and with weapons and prohibited substances. It's hard to believe that this guy had barely turned 18 at the time. It was then that Connor Chapman's name first hit the pages of newspapers. This happened after his next attempt to escape from law enforcement officers in a stolen car. Patrolmen noticed a local Audi on the street that was moving with violations. They immediately demanded that the driver stop and get out of the car with his hands raised. But Connor was not going to give up so easily. He sharply pressed on the gas and began to flee, provoking a real chase in the style of action movies. During this crazy race, the young criminal managed to violate, it seems, all possible traffic rules. Chapman constantly exceeded the speed limit, accelerating to 80 km/h where the maximum allowed speed was 30. He repeatedly drove into the oncoming lane, risking not only his own life, but also the safety of other road users. The finale of this story was quite expected. Unable to cope with the control on the next maneuver, Connor crashed into the curb. From a strong impact, the car was turned around and thrown to the side of the road. The hapless driver himself miraculously managed to get out of the mangled car unharmed. But his adventures that day did not end there. Jumping out of the wrecked car, Connor rushed headlong to flee, trying to hide from the police in the roadside bushes. However, this did not help him. The patrol officers caught up with the fugitive after only a few hundred meters. And even in this seemingly hopeless situation, Chapman managed to wriggle out. When he was being detained, the guy stated with an absolutely sincere look that he was just waiting in those bushes for his buddy. Of course, no one believed this excuse. His lie was too obvious. During the trial, Connor's lawyer tried to justify his client, claiming that he simply fell under the harmful influence of older comrades. Like, Chapman himself is not a bad person who should not be thrown behind bars, but released to freedom, giving a chance to reform. The defender even stated that his client allegedly had attention deficit disorder and a whole bunch of other mental disorders. However, all these tricks did not help. The court found Connor guilty on all charges. The motive for the murder was as simple as a door. It was competition between two local gangs. Connor simply blindly killed an innocent person to satisfy the needs of the gang who were dividing this territory at the time, and after which he was supposed to go to Spain to cover his tracks. This scoundrel was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to early release after 48 years. The guy also received a ban on driving a car, which was in effect after his release. Thus, the novice criminal achieved 14 convictions for 30 criminal episodes by the time he reached the age of majority. Obviously, he was not going to change and categorically refused to fit into society. Everyone understood that he was potentially dangerous, but there were no legal grounds for isolating him from the father of the murdered woman. Announced his desire to organize a fund to support victims similar to his daughter. He believed that the main goal would be to fight for a reduction in the number of weapons in the hands of civilians. The bereaved man wanted this tragic accident to become a lesson and help save the lives of the same innocent people in the future. I was glad to see you on my channel. Come again and don't forget to subscribe so as not to miss new videos. Until we meet again.